What's up guys, Mr. Gamboa here, back again for another history video. This time, it's a quick little review. We're going to review federalism and how we got to the point where we are with our US government. So, get ready, take some notes, let's get ready to get this started. Let's dig into the content.
Hold on to your butts.
Alright, now let's take it back to the beginning. Let's go back and examine the Articles of Confederation, which was America's first attempt at establishing a formal government. Now, here's the thing about the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was fairly weak and ineffective, and it really proved throughout the time that it operated as. It had the inability to tax citizens. It had the inability to wager and monitor the economy, and a matter of fact, a lot of the different states use their own different currencies in this time period. In addition to that, the Articles of Confederation had no executive branch and no judicial branch. So things were really wild at this time that the Articles of Confederation was established. Now, there's a big problem, a huge problem with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation did not allow for the establishment of a long-standing army, a national long-standing army. Now, that's a big problem because when Daniel Shea, a pissed-off farmer, decides to take up action against the federal government has no assurance. They have no defense to help get back or to help defend themselves. And so in this situation, Daniel Shea really stirs up a lot of trouble. And with Daniel Shea's rebellion, we see the beginning of the American senators beginning to shape and change what they believe, and they begin to think about restructuring the government and changing things a little bit differently. So, that is the Articles of Confederation.
That's weak sauce, Dan. Do not enter that sauce in the county fair because it is weak.
So next, at the Constitutional Convention, senators and representatives all come together from the different states to come and draft out a new form of government. Now, there are a lot of questions to be asked at this convention, like what representation should each state have? How much should they have? And who should be the overwhelmingly control of the whole country? So there's a bunch of conversations going on and a bunch of plans that are being drafted. And there are two prominent plans that get drafted around this time: the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Now I want to go ahead and talk about the Virginia plan first. Now, the Virginia plan pretty much advocates on representation based off population. They believe that the states with the bigger populations should get more say in the legislature. So pretty much whatever they need to get done, whatever legislation that needs to get passed, the bigger states should dictate the way that things go. However, this is a big problem for a lot of smaller states. Smaller states believed in more equity and more equality based off of the different states. So they proposed their own plan, the New Jersey plan. Now the New Jersey plan pretty much emphasizes on equal representation in legislature. So each state will receive only 2 representatives. But this is seen as a huge problem for the bigger states. So what ends up happening at this convention? We have a compromise, a huge compromise, a great compromise from the good old state of Connecticut. Now, at the state of Connecticut pretty much proposed that there would be a fusion between the 2 plans. That in the House of Representatives, there would be representation based off the population. So for example, the good state of California has the most representatives in the House of Representatives because of its population. And in addition to that, the Senate would follow along the New Jersey plan and would have 2 representatives from each state. So kind of accommodating for both sides here. And in addition to that, there is an establishment of 3 branches of government, including the executive and judicial branch. So we've covered our conventions, but we're not out of the woods yet. There's an issue on what to do with slavery. What to do with the slaves in each state. Should we consider them citizens, or should we consider them as property? Obviously, the slave states want to consider them as part of the population so they can get more of a boost in legislature. However, after negotiations, they decide to agree on the 3/5 plan. The 3/5 plan pretty much states that every slave would be considered 3/5 of a person, and it would pretty much advocate on behalf of trying to minimize the slave states from importing more slaves, or to pretty much shift the way that legislator operates. So this is what we have at the convention. But of course, we have opponents to this. We're not out of the woods just quite yet. We have opponents that are going to fight the drafting of this new constitution. We're going to have two different parties now that are going to arise and argue their points. And we'll talk about that in just a second.
Why can't we all just get along?
Now, these two rivals, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, they came together and they just couldn't agree on the drafting of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution was overreaching and that they were going to establish an executive branch that was going to be very similar to the one in Great Britain. And the Federalists believed that they needed to establish a strong federal government for the strength of the country. Now, both of them had great arguments ultimately. The Anti-Federalists, arguing on behalf of the poor, believed in establishing certain rights for the people. And they believed, again, that if the executive branch got established, that there would be some corruption there. That having a long-standing army that the federal branch could control was a bad thing, and they could manipulate the people, and in turn could bring them back to the way things were before they won their independence. The Federalists argued that in order for a nation to survive, they needed a strong, stable government. And so they had a series of back and forth debates, but ultimately they decided again in compromise. So the Constitution does get ratified, but along with that Constitution, we have the drafting of the Bill of Rights. We'll cover that next.
And out. The champion is beating back in the corner. No!
Let's talk about those Bill of Rights, baby. So let's talk about the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Your rights that are given to you. So make sure that you know them. Let's start off with Amendment number 1. Amendment number 1 goes on and says you have the freedom of petition, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, and of course the freedom of religion. Also, you have Amendment number 2, the freedom to bang bang, to hold and bear arms. Now, going on to the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment protects you from quartering soldiers in your house. If you see a soldier in your house, tell him he has to sleep on the porch. Now, Amendment number 4. Amendment number 4 says that you are protected from unlawful searches and seizures. So if somebody wants to check your bag, you gotta say, show me your warrants. Amendment number 5, cover your mouth and hold it tight, because you don't have to self-incriminate yourself. Also, it protects you from double jeopardy, which means you don't have to go back to court for one thing that you're already proven innocent from. Next, you have Amendment number 6. Point to your watch. 6. Point to your watch. That's right. Amendment number 6 says you have the right to a speedy trial. Amendment number 7 says, hey, look at these guys in the back. You have the right to a fair trial based on a jury of your peers. Amendment number 8 specifies that you must not be punished or tortured, and there must not be an excessive bail to be put on you. Amendment number 9. 9 guarantees personal rights guaranteed to you. So something that is not fundamentally put in the Constitution, fundamental rights like the freedom of life itself, the freedom to breathe, obvious, right? Those are given to you. And also, Amendment number 10. Amendment number 10 says any right that's not specifically stated here is held to the states. So the states have power if it's not specifically stated in the Constitution, giving that to the states some type of sway, some type of power that the Anti-Federalists really wanted to incorporate in their Articles of Confederation. All right, you got your 10 amendments.
Is it for what? Arresting me for what? I'm not allowed to stand up for myself? I thought this was America. Huh? Isn't this America? I'm sorry, I thought this was America.
All right, let's talk about federalism. Now, what is federalism, you may be asking? Well, simply put, federalism is the separation between the federal power and the state's power. So now that you've gotten a little general overview of what federalism is, let's talk about how our system of government currently works today. Let's talk about our three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So let's start with the executive branch. The executive branch is the president and his cabinet members. Now, the president has exclusive powers in terms of being able to decide on pieces of legislation, whether to sign off on pieces of legislation or to veto a piece of legislation. To veto, again, means to send it back. That piece of legislation isn't ready. So the president also has different varying powers because he is the executive branch and he gets exclusive executive powers. For example, he is the commander-in-chief of the army. But let's not mistake this, ladies and gentlemen. The president cannot wage war independently by himself. The legislative branch, which we will talk about next, has the authority to authorize the president to declare war. Now, to talk about the legislative branch is a bit of the grunt workers of the branches of government. They are the people that get the laws and legislation passed. They are the ones that are writing and constantly reviewing different laws and legislation. They review economic budgets. And so that is their role. They are essentially preparing themselves. They're preparing the law. They're preparing the budgets for the president to later review. And if it gets sent back to the legislative branch can either rework it, retweak it, or they can simply try to build a new law if they are simply interested in that, as we have seen very recently with the healthcare repeal and also with the tax reform. So a thing to look out in the future. But now we must talk about our judicial branch. The judicial branch is the Supreme Court. Now, what does the Supreme Court do? The Supreme Court has 9 justices, and in those justices, their main job is to pretty much interpret the law. They have this thing called judicial review. And what judicial review gives the judicial branch, it pretty much gives them the authority to take a look at a new piece of legislation, a new law, and to review whether or not it aligns with the Constitution. The 9 justices get to decide whether a new law is constitutional or not. Now, if it isn't constitutional, then that law is pretty much shrunken down. But if it is constitutional, then the law pretty much stands as it is. The president gets to appoint Supreme Court justices, and they get to stay pretty much until they retire, or they can stay until they die, essentially, in the as a Supreme Court justice. So there you have your 3 branches of government. You have your judicial branch, your legislative branch, and finally your executive branch. Make sure you got that. All right, so let's go over a few little tidbits before we leave. Now, let's go back and review that last term, judicial review. Where does the term judicial review come from? Well, it comes from the very famous court case, Marbury versus Madison. In that court case, the Supreme Court Marshal pretty much ensured that the Supreme Court would interpret the law based on the Constitution. So, there you have that. Judicial review comes from Marbury versus Madison.
My God, is it possible? Have the boys in the lab confirm this.
Sir, our math shows that the bird is equal to or greater than the word.
Check it again!
Okay, before we leave, let's talk about George Washington and John Adams. So George Washington was elected as the first representative, the first leader of the executive branch of the United States. He is the father of our country. Why else? Because he helped lead the independent movement. So with that being said, George Washington pretty much has a tame presidency. He retires eventually to his house, his estate, but before leaving, he pens the nation a very famous farewell letter, telling the nation to please stay away from foreign affairs and to stay away from political parties. But of course, that wasn't necessarily the case. Because a little bit afterwards, the United States does get involved in foreign affairs, and it does establish political parties. Your first example of political parties comes from the early Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Now, the Federalists are the first to win their presidency, and of course, these are the same Federalists, the same elites that were arguing for the creation of the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans, as they now refer to themselves, they are the anti-Federalists, essentially. They just branded themselves with a different name, and they are arguing pretty much on behalf of the common man again. The Democratic Republicans later put forth a candidate, which is Thomas Jefferson, who will become the third president of the United States. But going back to John Adams' presidency, John Adams had a pretty controversial presidency as well, because during his term, he was able to sign the Sedition Act. Now, the Sedition Act pretty much laid out a framework to punish people for speaking out against the executive branch and the bodies of government. Now, this was seen as a very controversial move because the Sedition Act was in direct violation of the Constitution. You're in violation of people's First Amendment rights to petition and to protest the government in cases that they may need to. And so this was seen as a moment of the government overstepping its power. And something that's soon to be overthrown later on with the election of Thomas Jefferson. But sedition acts occur over and over and over again throughout U.S. history, and it will show up especially in times of war. It's hard to criticize the government in a time of war when all hands need to be on deck. Now, with that quick little review, I hope you guys have a great time studying, and please do your best and know that you are your best. You've got this.
I know. Does that answer your question? Sincerely yours, The Breakfast Club.
Don't